Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Quentin Wodon and I work at the World Bank, and part of my work is related to early childhood development. What I would like to do today is to run you through some of the recent work we have been doing at the World Bank on investing in young children for high returns. This work is joint with Amina Denboba and Rebecca Sire, who are my colleagues at the World Bank. And after a very brief introduction as to why we should invest in young children, the rest of the presentation will essentially be devoted to a number of tools that we have developed over the last year or two at the World Bank and that we hope can be useful to you. These tools are available. The references are at the end of the presentation, and we would hope that you would download those tools and look at them at the same time perhaps as the presentation. That will give you much more detail than what I can do in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So the first question that I would like to consider is why investing in young children. Several of the other videos in this series have talked about that, so I will go very, very quickly. But you can identify a number of reasons. First, investing in young children is obviously needed for survival and for good health for the children. You also have quite a bit of neuroscience that demonstrates that quite a few of the capabilities that children can develop are developed actually in the first 1,000 days of their life. I work in the education department of the World Bank, and so for us, it's also very important to mention the link between investments that you can make in the first few years of life and the success that children will have in school, in terms of being more likely to enroll, being less likely to drop out, and achieving higher learning outcomes. Now, these are, if you will, sectoral arguments that are in favor of investing in young children. But it's very important, especially for us at the World Bank, to also make a point about equity and a point about the economic returns that you can have from investing in young children. Now, you might see here a slide that comes from work by Heckman, a Nobel Prize economist, who has done quite a bit of work demonstrating that the returns to interventions early in life tend to be much higher for every dollar that you spend than the returns from interventions later in life. The most promising intervention in terms of returns are those really happening early on. Preschools would follow, normal school would follow, and job training programs are much more difficult to implement with very high returns. Now, that's the high economic returns argument, but there is also an equity argument. So the new goals of the World Bank are to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030 and boosting shared prosperity, which is to increase the growth of income of the bottom 40% of the population in the countries where we work. And the point is this: if you do not invest early enough in the first few years of life of children, it is extremely difficult later on to reverse the damage that was caused. It is extremely difficult to be able to help children to learn, let's say in secondary education, if they have not succeeded in primary education, which depends in part on how well they do as very young children. And so there's a very strong equity argument for investing in young children that is beyond the fact that these investments have high returns. Now, these arguments about investing in young children, you know about them because you have discussed them or you have seen them in other videos of this series. What I would like to do now is three things. First, I would like to share with you some of the good news about the recent experience of the World Bank in terms of investing in young children. Next, I would like to share with you a number of interventions that we call essential and that we have identified as priorities for governments. And third, I would like to talk to you about some of the broad principles that government should follow when considering interventions for young children. So let's start with the first point, which is the recent experience of the World Bank in terms of lending and activities. Now, early childhood development has become well recognized in development circles as a key priority area for intervention. But that was not necessarily the case just 5 to 10 years ago. At the World Bank, a number of new strategies for education, for health, nutrition, and population, and for social protection, all of those new strategies that were adopted around 2009, 2011, actually mention specifically the importance of investing in young children. And what we try to do is to see whether those policy statements have actually been followed by action, and whether lending as well as other activities related to early childhood development did increase over the last few years. So what we did is a review of World Bank operations and activities related to early childhood development over the last dozen years or so. We looked at both lending and grants, which is the funding part, and we looked at analytical work such as country studies, impact evaluations, and other products. What you can see in this first graph is that over the last dozen years, the World Bank has provided $3.3 billion in funding commitments for operations directly related to ECD, early childhood development. And the good news is that this has increased actually quite dramatically over the last few years after this recognition as part of our strategies for education, health, nutrition, and social protection. The next graph shows you the trend in terms of the analytical work, which is also important. Again, that would include country studies to advise governments, technical assistance. It would also include impact evaluations. It includes a new product that I'll mention later, which is called Saber. And you can see that as well, the commitments have increased quite substantially over the last few years. And this is not only true for the World Bank, it's probably true for many other development actors, but that's the good news that the level of seriousness with which multilateral organizations and other donors or funders, as well as governments, the level of seriousness with which ECD is taken into account has really increased in recent years. Now, with such an increase, it's very important for us to try to give guidance, not only to countries, but also internally, to our World Bank staff who are working in the regions and are in direct dialogue with policymakers. And the guidance, or one of the guidances that we have provided, is to try to identify a number of essential interventions that should be funded, if the budget allows, for ECD. This is not really new. I mean, other people have done that. It's very clear that you have different types of interventions that you can implement at various ages in the life cycle of a young child and also before birth. What we have tried to do is to identify those interventions perhaps a bit more precisely, and as well suggest what is the cost of those interventions. Often they're actually pretty affordable, and what are some of the impacts of those interventions. Now, in this video, it would take too much time to discuss the interventions as well as illustrative costs of implementation in countries, and again, the impacts that those interventions have. I would refer you to the guide that is mentioned in references, but what I will do is simply go quickly just listing those 25 essential interventions. So this broad figure maps the interventions according to the age of the child, from the pregnancy of the mother until about 60 months. And you have different color codings for different sectors: nutrition, health, education, and social protection. Now, let me just go quickly through 5 packages of interventions, and together these 5 packages provide you with those 25 interventions. So the first package is something that should be provided to families throughout the life of the child, and from conception to, let's say, entry into primary school. So we have identified a number of them. The first one is not really an intervention, but it's a reminder that the education of the mother is extremely important and is a key determinant of how well a child will do. The second intervention is planning for families, so family planning. The third intervention is education for parents and for communities and support networks. Essentially, if you will, to provide information about good practices that parents and communities can implement related to ECD. Social assistance transfer programs are listed because we and other multilateral organizations have a lot of experience in implementing, among others, conditional cash transfers. And many of these transfers, which are provided to families, provided that they, for example, send their children to school or that they go often to a health center, these interventions have been shown not only to reduce poverty, but to achieve quite large impacts on the development of children. The next intervention is the prevention and treatment of maternal depression that may be more dependent on the type of country in which you are as to whether this is actually implementable or affordable, rather. But we wanted to list it. Parental leave and childcare is actually very important. And perhaps not all of the countries would have, for example, systems of parental leave that reach many parents because the parents would work in the informal sector and might not be eligible. But childcare is really feasible. And apart from providing benefits to the children, it provides tremendous benefits to the parents because the mothers can then work and through the earnings help the household, for example, to escape poverty. And just as an example, we had a recent evaluation of a program like this in Brazil that was extremely successful in facilitating employment and earnings for the mothers. Child protection regulatory frameworks, this can cover a number of areas which are also important. Access to health care, of course. Micronutrients and supplementation and fortification. This can be done in different ways through various food programs. Access to safe water, which is key for diarrhea. Adequate sanitation, hygiene and hand washing. All of those are very well-known interventions. I'm not going to go here in details. Again, you have in the documents examples of costs and impacts, but they are very important as part of the continuum of services that families need from conception until a child goes to primary school. Now, the first package is very broad and consists of a number of services that have to be provided throughout the life of the child. Now, the next four packages are specific for points in time. We call the first one the pregnancy package with three main interventions. Antenatal visits for the mothers, iron and folic acid supplementation for pregnant mothers, and counseling on adequate diet for pregnant mothers as well. And the major gains are the prevention of maternal and neonatal mortality, reduced risks of anemia, and reduced risk of low birth weight. The next package is what we call the birth package from 0 to 6 months. The delivery should be attended by a qualified health personnel. Birth registration is more part of the social protection interventions. It's very important actually in some of the countries for the children to get full rights and sometimes even to go to school, for example. Exclusive breastfeeding through 6 months is also one of the key interventions. Actually, many of those interventions are extremely cheap to implement and can have very high returns. Next, from the birth until 5 to 6 years of age, immunizations, growth monitoring and promotion, so following how the child is developing over time, which is essential to be able to refer the child to specific services when needed. Therapeutic zinc supplementation for diarrhea, optimal feeding practices, and deworming. Deworming, for example, has been shown in many studies to have also a very strong impact on schooling and school attainment and achievement. Finally, from 3 to 6 years, the preschool package, providing quality childhood education programs, early childhood education programs through preschools, and then ensuring the transition from preschool to primary school. Now, this slide just summarizes these 5 packages over time. Again, the family support package, followed by the pregnancy, the birth, the child health and development, and the preschool packages. Now, none of this is really new. This is based on a lot of research over the last 10 to 20 years. But what is important, and what we hope that this identification of specific intervention will provide, is ammunition to show the very high returns to those interventions, as well as for many of them, the very low cost of implementing them. And the idea of this guide, which is no more than 20 pages long, was for a task manager or somebody in the Ministry of Education, somebody in the Ministry of Health, and so on, to have dialogue with, for example, the Ministry of Finance in a country, and to be able to argue that these interventions really are needed and that they are, for the most part, actually affordable. Now, this guide on investing in young children lists those 25 interventions as well as, again, examples of costs in different countries and examples of returns from evaluation studies. It also outlines 4 principles that we believe are very important for countries to have good ECD systems, if you will. So these 4 principles are, again, nothing really new, but they are very important to recognize. The first one is that you need to actually conduct an ECD diagnostic in a country and establish a comprehensive strategy. Now, one of the reasons why we mention this is because we have developed tools, and I will mention and explain them later on, that help you do that, or that help a staff from a government agency to do it. This is called SABER, and SABER stands for Systems Approach to Better Education Results. This was developed by the Education Department, but in the case of ECD, it covers as well health, nutrition, and population, and social protection. And so the point is that you really need to have a comprehensive diagnostic before you think about your strategy. Why? Because this is a very complex domain, and precisely because of its complexity, you have multiple agencies. Think, for example, of the Ministry of Education, the Ministry sometimes of Gender, the Ministry of Health, Ministries of Social Protection, others, different agencies. All of those play different roles in implementing those 25 interventions that I mentioned earlier, and you really need to have a comprehensive assessment of what is done and how it is done, and as well of some of the regulatory mechanism in the countries in order to be able to provide a strong strategy. Now, one aspect of that strategy, and that's the second principle, should be the coordination and the wide implementation. And you can imagine that with so many interventions, not only in terms of line ministries, but also in terms of different levels of interventions. For example, the federal state might have some areas of competence. A state might have others. The municipality or the district might be responsible for other aspects. So you have both in terms of different line ministries horizontally and vertically in terms of the levels of intervention. You have this very complicated set of actors, and you need to be able to implement widely. So you shouldn't forget any one of those 25 interventions, but you also need to coordinate so that you don't have duplication between different agencies doing the same things. Now, the third principle is to integrate services to achieve synergies and cost savings. I mentioned that quite a few of those interventions are relatively cheap. Some interventions are not that cheap. And the point here is that not only you may achieve more in terms of child growth and development by combining intervention, but separately, you may also achieve more at a lower cost if you do combine those interventions. And so when you have different entry points in the life of a family or a child, you should try it as much as possible to combine interventions, to combine the programs from different agencies so that you achieve cost savings. The last principle is to monitor, evaluate, and scale up. Now, we do have quite a bit of evidence on the fact that successful interventions achieve really good outcomes in terms of child development growth and then later in life. I mean, some studies, for example, have shown that some early stimulation projects or interventions for young children generated 30 to 40% higher earnings in adulthood for those children when they were working. So you can have really tremendous impacts. But you need to monitor, you need to evaluate, and then you need to scale up based on those interventions. And we have examples at the World Bank of interventions that on paper looked good, that were evaluated using randomized controlled trials, and that were shown for any different reasons not to have worked. So it's not clear that every time you would intervene, you will achieve success. The quality of the intervention that you implement is very important. And in order to really understand the details of what is going on, you need to have really robust, not only monitoring, but when you can, impact evaluations. And I mention this because at the World Bank, we have invested substantially over the last few years through a program that is called the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund in interventions evaluation. And one of the core aspects of that effort is actually focused on early childhood development. Now, I mentioned to you that in this video, apart from mentioning briefly the reasons why we need to invest in young children, I would outline a number of key interventions, these 25 interventions, then a number of principles that countries should follow. I also shared with you some of the good news in terms of the resources allocated at the World Bank, but also by others to ECD. And I would like to conclude with discussing one of the tools that we have made available for countries to essentially do the first and two principles, which is to do a good diagnostics, to establish a strategy, and to coordinate and implement widely. Now, that tool is called SABER. Let me explain again what it is or what it stands for: Systems Approach for Better Education Results. And if you think about what it tries to do, it tries to unpack the many policies and programs that countries put in place with a special module for ECD, or domain, as we call it, and to try to really understand what is the policy intent and what is the level of implementation of the policy. If you think, for example, about the education aspect of all of this, you often have information on the quantity and the quality of inputs. I mean, these would be, for example, the preschools, the teachers, the materials used there, and so on. And then you have measurement in terms of the learning achievement of the children. But often it's very difficult to have a systematic analysis of what led you from your inputs to your outcomes in terms of learning. And so SABER tries to unpack, if you will, that black box, which is the policies and the programs that leads from inputs to outcomes. Now, in the case of early childhood development, the tool, the diagnostic tool of the policies implemented in countries is organized around 3 broad policy goals and then 9 policy levels. The policy goals are establishing an enabling environment, implementing widely, and then monitoring and assuring quality. And of course, there is some parallels between those principles and or those policy goals and the principles I mentioned earlier. The policy levers are what's the legal framework. For example, a large share of ECD interventions in developing countries are actually implemented not by the public sector, but by private operators. So what is the legal framework for entry, for quality assurance, and so on of these private operators? What is the mechanism of intersectoral coordination? Do you have an agency that is in charge of coordinating the work of all those ministries and agencies, as well as levels of authority in terms of the administrative structure of the country for intervention? In terms of finance, what are the resources allocated overall to ECD, and how are they allocated, and are they secure? In terms of implementing widely, this deals with the scope of the programs. Do you have programs in the different areas that you need to have programs? I mean, think again of the 25 interventions. What is the coverage of those programs? Do you actually reach most of the children you need to reach? And then what is the equity? Do you reach the children that are the most disadvantaged? And here, something that maybe I should have highlighted before, there is quite a bit of evidence that shows that the impact of those interventions tend to be the largest among the most deprived communities or the most deprived children. Those are also actually the most difficult to reach sometime. But the highest returns will be obtained by reaching those deprived children. And so if you have to select who might receive various interventions because of budget constraints, I mean, the advice is really to try to target as much as you can first to the most vulnerable. And monitoring and evaluation and assuring quality has to do with data, availability, quality standards, and then whether, for example, service providers do comply with those quality standards. And so the way this works is that we have then, for each of these 9 policy levers and each of these 3 policy goals, a very detailed questionnaire that we provide answers to at the level of a country to do this broad diagnostic. Now, the tool has been implemented in about 50 countries so far, and then countries are rated in each of these levers and goals as being latent, emerging, established, and advanced. And essentially, these diagnostics helps to identify some of the areas where there could be improvements in terms of the policy setup, if you will, of the country. So to conclude, some suggestions for what we need to do next. One is that we need to better identify the most cost-effective interventions that can be brought to scale. This is not as easy as it sounds, because it is often the case that pilot projects which achieve very good results do not necessarily achieve the same results when you scale them up. So both the issue of cost effectiveness and the issue of scale up are very important. We need to build the evidence base in low and middle income countries about what is happening and what is working. I did mention Saber and the ECD domain of Saber. Another very good example of work in this area is the mix survey that have been implemented in many countries by UNICEF with specific modules on ECD that are extremely useful. And finally, we need to have a continued dialogue on the science and the economics, including for integrated investment. And I do want to mention here another recent initiative, which is from the Institute of Medicine, the Forum on Investing in Young Children Globally, that shows the promise of being a platform for gathering quite a bit of the emerging evidence on those areas. You have in these last slides some of the references that you can consult in order to have more details on what I talked about. One additional reference that I want you to be aware of is an e-learning course for policymakers and practitioners that we just completed at the World Bank. It's about 4 to 5 hours of e-learning with different modules, and it goes in much more details in some of what I explained here. Again, the references are available, and if you need any more information, you can contact us. Thank you.